Welcome to Two Nerds One Podcast. This is Scott, and today we have a very special guest. His name is
Tom.
Hi. So welcome, Tom. Thanks for joining us today. Today we wanted to talk about foreign policy and what's going on in the world. Is there an issue that's pressing and that you have your eyes on at the moment, Tom?
I think when we had first started talking about this, one thing that was interesting to me was the Nagorno-Karabakh war going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but that's actually been more or less concluded. I found that interesting for a variety of reasons, and one of them which is that most people probably had never even heard that was going on.
So I only heard it because you talked about it, and I couldn't make sense what the hell it was about.
Yeah, it was pretty complicated. It took me listening to some other podcasts and reading about it on Wikipedia a bit to even understand the basics of it. But yeah, one interesting thing about this war is it lasted maybe 4 or 5 weeks, and the last time the two countries fought over that region, it lasted like 4 or 5 years. So
it's a piece of land that's in Azerbaijan or vice versa?
Well, that depends on who you ask, of course. But, most countries would say that is a part of Azerbaijan, that while it's within the territorial boundaries of the country, Azerbaijan has not been able to exercise control of that region. And this goes back at least 100 years too, as far as it being like a checkerboard area of different ethnic groups living amongst each other and not getting along very well.
So what are the two factions that are involved then? I mean, you said the countries, right? But
yeah, so to give a brief introduction, Armenia is one of the countries involved. And, you know, if you guys played Rome Total War back in the day, that was actually a faction back then. So they go way back in that region. And Armenia as a modern state comes out of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire when there was actually the Armenian genocide, where estimates are there are about 1 million Armenians killed by the Turkish state.
during World War One, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So after World War One, the state of Armenia exists, and it is rapidly part of the Soviet Union, basically. It's a state in the Soviet Union. It's not like a Warsaw Pact country that has more autonomy.
Right, okay, but it was former Soviet bloc.
Yeah, and Azerbaijan is also a former Soviet state that the two never got along well, and the Soviet Union was challenged by trying to keep the peace there. And obviously, as far as their interest in keeping an internal peace, they would look at Armenian ethnic areas in Azerbaijan and tell Azerbaijan basically just lay off them and let them do their own thing. That area had some limited autonomy. And then when the Soviet Union fell apart, then the large empire exercising control over the area was gone, and these two groups almost immediately started fighting each other.
So the tensions had been there for a while then. I mean, obviously, but I mean the modern tensions, I guess.
Yeah, the previous war was late 80s and early 90s when the Soviet Union was falling apart. And like I said, I think it lasted about 4 or 5 years. And so that was like practically a generation ago. But long story short, Armenia won and was effectively controlling part of Azerbaijan's territory. And while not formally claiming it for themselves, they were trying to get that way. And there was like a ceasefire, but they'd been fighting off and on a smaller scale for a while until this year when it pretty much blew out into a full-on war again.
Yeah, so I saw kind of a report of the fightings. So it lasted a few weeks or a month, is that right?
Yeah, I think it started maybe late September, and then it was done by early November. And it started as like another one of these border clashes, but became apparent pretty quickly that Azerbaijan was not just stirring up shit. They were, going fully on board with trying to take back that territory.
Yeah, we're recall seeing the Twitter updates from, I think, the Prime Minister or President saying that they had a certain amount of days to give up, and then they're coming in one way or another, right?
Yeah, that sounds right. There was like an ultimatum, and I mean, I think both those countries kind of throw rhetoric at each other a lot, but in this case, Azerbaijan was not bluffing at all, and a lot of people are speculating that they're using the coronavirus pandemic as kind of cover, like the whole world's in chaos right now. This is the one score we really want to settle. This is our time to do it, and it worked out for them, so.
So they ended up, I don't know if war really ends in victory anymore, but they got what they wanted.
Yeah, the war started off pretty well for the Armenians. They had the upper ground literally in some cases and were pretty dug in, in the event this would ever happen. But as the war went on, they took heavy casualties, and aside from a few hard points where the Armenians were really dug in and holding their ground, the Azerbaijanis found some weak points and were basically cutting off the enclave that Armenians were trying to claim. And they also suffered a lot of material losses as far as tanks, heavy equipment, all that stuff. So at one point, I think this all happens within 24 to 48 hours. The Armenians launched a ballistic missile strike against Azerbaijan. I think they might have hit Baku, which is a huge city in the capital of Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan also shot down a Russian military helicopter by accident. And between those two events, it sounds like Russia got pissed off and told Armenia, guys, you don't come to the table right now and take whatever terms you're going to get. We're going to leave you out to dry here. So
who is Russia supporting? Armenia?
So they have close ties with both countries, but they are closer with Armenia. They actually have a defensive pact with Armenia proper and have military bases there. But the fighting was all over this disputed territory, so there was not really any question of Russia coming into the conflict on Armenia's side unless things really escalated. And Russia probably didn't want to piss off Azerbaijan because that's a richer country with oil and a lot of business interests that Russia wouldn't want to destroy over this.
All right, so they tried to keep it hands off to a point.
Yeah, so Russia was selling weapons to the Armenians pretty heavily, and Azerbaijan was buying a lot of weapons from Israel and Turkey and maybe some other NATO country. But technically Russia is still pretty close to both countries. Both countries, a lot of the citizens speak Russian, and so that adds another element to the conflict that makes it a little complicated.
Right. So what has the reaction been in the region? How people reacted to the way it ended up?
Well, Azerbaijan during the war they have these billboards with video you can play on it, and they were showing video from some of the drones that they were referred to as suicide drones because it's basically a drone that has a warhead on it, and you steer the drone with the camera on the nose of the aircraft right into your target. So they're getting a lot of video of that and showing on the billboards of them, blowing up Armenian equipment and people in some cases. And
it was a missile with an engine, basically?
Yeah, it's hard to distinguish between a drone and a cruise missile at a certain point because, but imagine
I guess a cruise missile doesn't take off like a plane.
Yeah, I've heard too the drones being used, the suicide drones, as persistent overwatch munition delivery devices or something. So basically a cruise missile, you hit it, you acquire a target, you launch the missile, the cruise missile hits it. But with these drones, you can have them hovering over the area, and the operator, is just hanging out in a trailer in a parking lot somewhere for hours waiting to find a target, and then they can just fly the thing right into it. So it's more of you look for targets of opportunity, and this thing's just hovering in the air waiting to find something.
Right, opportunistic.
Jesus. It's an interesting take on our program in the Middle East, I guess.
Yeah, the one thing that interests me about this is you don't get too many conflicts that are between relatively developed countries using modern equipment and, are pretty close in power. Usually it's one larger country like the United States just beating the crap out of another country that can't really fight back. So.
Right. It's like two bullies in school about the same height and weight picked on each other.
Yeah, a fight like that's always way more interesting than just senior taking a freshman and throwing him into a locker or whatever.
That situation, do you think it's going to be stable or?
I think it's going to be stable for a while. Just, I was saying, Armenia had to throw in the towel because they lost hundreds of tanks and a lot of other vehicles and artillery, stuff like that. So they're still pretty pissed off, you can tell. I think they beat up their leader in parliament or something like that. And, there might be a lot of people ready to grab a rifle and run down to the mountains and fight Azerbaijanis, but realistically, they can't do that, especially now with Russian peacekeepers patrolling the border and stuff.
Okay. So it'll be interesting keeping eyes on the situation. It's always the theme you see of history repeating itself, right? And it happened in the 80s.
Yeah, exactly. Azerbaijanis were just stewing with rage for a generation waiting to get this territory back. And it's just as likely Armenia will be like that too, just waiting for their chance to, waiting for the next coronavirus pandemic in 20 to 30 years to launch their own offensive to take back the territory.
Right.
I have to wonder though, is it worthwhile? Is the land they want valuable?
I think in that region, some of it is just crappy mountainous territory, but there are some valleys and stuff that are more useful. But
even so. Like,
You wouldn't
I
think it'd
don't
be
know.
worth dying over, I agree, but there's almost some parallels to like the Israel-Palestine conflict as far as the people living in this region are extremely adamant about the historical legacy of the area, and we've always been here, we're never going to leave, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, to your point, I mean, even it's the same thing, right? It's Palestine and Israel. Like parts that they fight over are literally just rocky desert. It's not. There's nothing there. There will be
yeah,
nothing there.
Right, doesn't that describe the Golan Heights pretty well? It's just kind of rocky, mountainous terrain.
yeah, I think that also got some strategic value. Yeah, people are very big on that for some reason. I think that's part of Syria that no one recognizes as part of Israel or vice versa right now. So yeah, there's a lot of parallels with that with this conflict. When the ironic part is the settlers in this case are the Armenians, if you want to look at it from who's on another country's territory, and Israel was the one supplying Azerbaijan with the weaponry. So if you're looking at parallels here, the Azerbaijan would have been like Palestinians, and the Armenians living in Azerbaijan would have been like the Israelis in settlements or whatever. But
Right,
it's
yeah.
not a very good analogy anyways.
Makes sense, though. I see the point you're trying to get out there. So are there any other global conflicts that you have your eyes on?
Well, everyone's pretty angry at China right now, but that's been going on forever. But I don't think that's going to really break into any conflict anytime soon. It's just probably going to be tensions increasing and decreasing depending on what's going on in the world.
Yeah, I read many articles about the mountainous region between China and India, how they had peacekeeping forces from both sides there, and they weren't allowed to have guns or something like that. So a bunch of them got into a fight and beat each other to death with like sticks and clubs.
Yeah, exactly. I thought that was interesting too, that it's another part of land you wouldn't think would be particularly valuable, but I guess I think China's trying to build a road there, or maybe India is, and they both claim the territory, and yeah, they're not supposed to have guns there, so when they run into each other and have a little fight, it's people beating each other with sticks and shoving each other off of like mountain cliffs and stuff.
Jesus Christ.
And I think India claimed tens of people died there, and China has not released how many casualties, but it's probably similar. So you're talking like 10 to 50 people on each side being killed or
Clubbed
severely.
to death.
Yeah, clubbed to death or,
Fuck.
falling off the side of a mountain. I think this happened in the middle of the night too, which probably didn't help anything.
Yeah, I think I remember reading China was building a road or they had a troop build up, and then I'm not saying who's at fault or anything. It just sounds like a really complicated political situation there.
Yeah, the stuff with territorial claims and whatnot is fascinating. Like I saw one map so Taiwan is formerly known as the Republic of China because when the Communist Revolution or Civil War was taking place and the communists drove the Chiang Kai-shek out of the country, he went to Taiwan and had a government in exile there, and then nothing happened with that, and it just turned into Taiwan as a country. But technically the government of Taiwan still has territorial claims to not only China but also like Mongolia and all these other places that you would scratch your head over and be like, it's been decades, you guys probably don't need to claim Mongolia anymore. But
And
I guess once you make a territorial claim, it's hard to give it up. You just don't want to admit defeat.
That's like China saying Tibet doesn't exist.
Yeah, I know less about that, but Tibet used to be like a major power for like 100 or 200 years and then just kind of slowly got swallowed up by China.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Dalai Lama has to live in exile.
Yeah, the whole thing is weird too, because when he dies, he's saying like he'll be reincarnated somewhere and then he'll let everyone know.
I thought he said that he was the last one.
That's what I
Can't
thought
remember
too.
if that's true. Yeah.
That's very modest of him.
I'm the very last one. You better,
So,
treat me well.
so I wonder if he's just trying to end the political crisis in that there's no longer going to be a strong spiritual leader for Buddhism. Maybe that's what his goal is.
I guess that makes more sense than from a narcissistic standpoint, but
Right, because he's been exiled to India. I think if he went back to Nepal and Tibet, he would be arrested, probably.
oh yeah. So Scott, from a standpoint of living in Germany, what sort of conflicts or tensions or whatnot do you see that, the average Joe on the street over here in the United States might not be aware of?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know much about it, but in Europe, there's this really small country. Yeah, so it's Transnistria, and it's between Moldova and Ukraine, and it's only recognized by, I think, Moldova, and then not by Ukraine. So it's kind of like a very similar situation where it's the enclave there. So you don't hear much about them, but it's just crazy to me that you can have two neighbors and have some awkward piece of land in the middle that is just not recognized. Always fun. And we had a business meeting. I work in logistics, and there was going to be a new airport code. Airport codes are signed by IATA, which is the International Air Transport Association. And there's lots of meetings that they have all over the place, like in just various European cities. And they were going to sign a new airport code, it's that three-letter thing, right? So LHR is London, ORD is Chicago, that kind of thing. LAX is probably Los Angeles. And there was one, I think, in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And there was another member of the group that was there that denied that this country existed. So he said, no, we can't assign the airport code because this country doesn't exist. And so it's interesting to see political turmoil kind of shift over into the business world, if that makes sense. So I kind of witnessed that one firsthand. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are just two kind of minor.
I haven't heard of that one, so that's interesting. It kind of, when you started describing that, it reminded me of something I read a while ago where some Bitcoin libertarians found there was some island between, I think, Croatia and some other country, and there was like a river bordering it, but an island in the river, and both countries claimed it, but it wasn't that big of a deal, so they just both ignored the island. And these libertarians thought they could row boats over there and just claim it for themselves and start their own micronation. But I think they just got arrested after like the first 5 people showed up.
So it didn't work out, is what you're
I
saying?
think I heard about that. Yeah, like a forum or something, right? Where they were like, yeah, and they like did all this research.
Yeah, they sounded so confident too.
Yeah,
I think the longer you live in your own bubble on the internet in a sub-forum, the more deranged and unrealistic you get about things like that.
I think you just described Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the internet certainly has the tendency to, allow communication, but people just tend to pigeonhole themselves into self-reaffirming communities, and then kind of defeats the purpose a little
Yeah,
bit.
they definitely go off the deep end after a while if they're in the same sort of community there. To return to your question, I just thought of another one. It's about Spain. So I think the Catalonia region has been trying to secede for a long time, and a couple of years ago they had an independence referendum where they voted to leave, and then Spain's government said, no, we don't recognize that, period, and they arrested the opposition leader. So
Oh, I remember that. I was actually in Spain.
So it's kind of like imagining Florida trying to break away from the U.S. and the government arrests the governor of Florida.
But didn't Spain say like go ahead and try, and then they did, and then they were like, oh, you're arrested now. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know the details of it, but I think they allowed the referendum to happen or something, and then when it passed,
yeah,
then,
they like encouraged them. I think if I remember
Yeah, I think
correctly.
that sounds right.
yeah, and
Then they just like immediately arrested everyone who started the referendum.
right.
Yeah.
Another one that's more relevant to us now is I shouldn't say the name, Belarus, right? So the Timoshenko leader guy in Belarus, he's being challenged by thousands of protesters that have been on the streets for a couple weeks. The opposition leader is a lady and she's in exile, but they're trying to strike for like forever, basically, to try to get him thrown out because he's obviously a puppet of Russia. That's always in the news over here.
Didn't he throw in the towel recently, or it's been a while since I heard of anything?
I honestly haven't kept up to date. It wouldn't surprise me just because if you have a total economic shutdown, you can't really do much with that. But
I think he said something like, fine, if you guys don't want me to be here, I'll just leave then.
man, if only other dictators would do that,
Yeah, we'll find out in January.
But I'm
Good one.
didn't see that one going.
So how did you guys form your early opinions of, let's say, U.S. foreign policy or our place in the world? Because I'm kind of curious about your experiences with that. I'll go ahead and start and say that in high school I took a class, History of the Cold War, and I started reading all the NSC documents and stuff, and it was just like the entire class was one overthrown government after another, and it just pretty much opened my brain to the skepticism of everything going on from the Cold War onwards. And
Could you be more specific about what do you mean, everything going on?
well, as far as the Cold War, the United States supported dictatorships that, did a lot of bad stuff. And then there were democratic governments that happened to be left-wing or maybe opened the relations with the Soviet Union that we went ahead and toppled. And a lot of horrible things happened there.
Right.
So,
Okay. I totally understand what you mean. I just want to be specific for our four listeners that
yes.
might be wondering what he's trying to talk about.
The
So
poor people
after,
that listen.
you read that over and over and over again, and then you see like, all right, Soviet Union fell apart, and then in the 90s, we destroyed Iraq once, then we came back and destroyed it again a second time. It's like, wow, it's not good.
Jacob, what about you?
To answer your question, sir, I think I was relatively ignorant of, I don't know, the failings of the U.S. government, I would say. Up until, I guess I never really thought about it. I wasn't really politically engaged until college. And there was 3 or 4 history majors on my floor that sort of opened my eyes, I guess I would say. And their ambivalence, their frustration, I guess, sort of rubbed off on me, I would say. Especially in my family, like my mom, she won't even discuss politics. Oh, I like to keep that private. And won't ever talk about shit like that.
Do you know her personal opinions on it and stuff?
Not really, honestly. I'll try to ask direct questions. Are you a Republican or whatever? And she's like, oh yeah. Him and Han doesn't really give an answer, right? So I guess part of it, I just wasn't really exposed. I went to public school and I was focused on other things besides geopolitics and politics in general. But yeah, I think once I had time to talk to people that I haven't really talked to before and meet people I haven't met and sort of explore that more, I think, yeah, college, I would say, is probably, I'm a little late to the game as far as politics, even at the most basic level.
Okay. But you got introduced to it via talking conversations with other people that changed or influenced your opinion.
Yeah. And even then, right, I think in college it was funny, or I wouldn't say we supported financially, but there was a joke how we liked Ron Paul because he was going to legalize weed.
Right.
And so, we were all on board on Ron Paul just as as a joke, I think. And, and we made... And it became a joke of the gold standard and how ludicrous that would be. And yeah, that was sort of my introduction to the lunacy and I don't know how to describe it better than the do as I say, not as I do sort of procedures of international relations with the U.S.
Okay. Makes sense. Yeah.
Well, especially too, right after 9/11, I guess, I was in high school. That sort of opened a lot of eyes, I guess.
For me, I will directly jump on that statement about 9/11 because I remember in high school where I was and all that during that day and kind of the surrealism of the whole event. And that was when I was thinking, okay, so what's going to happen? And we had in high school, it was a pretty open high school, so they had discussions about a panel saying, okay, what do you think should happen? And they would ask the students. And I would say that everyone wanted to go to war with Iraq, including myself at the time.
Wow.
And I was thinking, yeah, it's obvious. Clearly, we have to deal with the problem. And then, I don't know, a couple months later, I was thinking, wait a minute, that doesn't really make sense to do this and to just destroy infrastructure of a country and bomb it and stuff like that. And then it turned out later that, maybe this is incorrect, but my understanding is that there were no WMDs found in Iraq.
I don't think they ever found any, but if they did, the Iraqis probably forgot they had them.
Yeah.
Well, we sold them. That's how we knew we were there.
Yeah.
I don't recall the situation with that, but I remember there wasn't really a smoking gun or something that could justify it as far as that. So it was just kind of okay,
yeah.
We had a war with Iraq, let's do it again. And then seeing the U.S. interests being represented as far as, I don't know, having bases in the region and possibly economic interests, because if you occupy a country, you can pretty much influence what's going to happen in the future. Right, so that was kind of part of it was seeing that progression of literal years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And yeah, just having this kind of endless quagmire of that situation going on. Maybe you have different opinions about those particular wars, but yeah, that's how I kind of got a bit critical of the U.S. foreign policy situation.
Yeah, I feel like when I was in high school, reading about the Cold War stuff and then 9/11 happening in the War on Terror, I think I was thinking the same thing, oh yeah, we can't allow Iraq to have WMDs. And then the cynical side of me that was just starting to grow at the time was they're probably lying about that actually.
I think that I never really understood that connection even in high school. We were attacked by a organization and then we invaded a country that had no ties. I didn't understand it.
Right. Allegedly, they had ties, is my understanding.
Yeah, I think the Bush administration was trying to at least muddy the waters on that because a lot of people on the street, if you ask them about it, they would just assume Saddam Hussein had something to do with it. So they weren't going to tell those people no, but as far as how they treated the media and stuff, they were trying to hint, oh, Saddam Hussein he could be working with Al-Qaeda, we might have some evidence here and there. And sort of evidence they were providing was some guy to just lie about something. Oh yeah, I saw bin Laden hanging out with Saddam at a resort or something.
But I think hindsight, right, that was all falsified.
Yes. We found out later that the CIA this wasn't like the entire organization, but there are elements of it that were basically just paying bribes to anyone who will, say they saw this or saw that or whatever. And after the fact, once you read about some of these, it becomes almost comical how stupid some of the stuff they were claiming as evidence was.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of misdirection there for the public opinion.
Now that we're talking through it, I think something that sort of stuck with me is I had a friend in my class who was of Indian descent. I can't remember if he was Pakistani or if I think he was actually from India. His family was from India. So he wasn't Middle Eastern, right? He was from India. But he said he had stories, right, after 9/11 that his family would be chased on the highway or
what?
He would get rocks thrown at his car. So yeah, I think that sort of opened my eyes to just the hatred that comes along with demonizing a group of people, right? It doesn't matter who they are as long as their skin is brown. I'm just going to hate them, right? So I think that is part of my thought process is that sort of opened my eyes to okay, well, I'm sure that is the same thing that potentially happens at the governmental level. Or they don't give a shit. They just want to kill some brown people, right? I don't know. They got a gun. They got to shoot it, right? They have the bullets. They just need a target. It was just bizarre.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just blind racism, but I think another element of it is just plain ignorance because there was a Sikh gas station owner or something who was murdered the day after 9/11, and the Sikhs have long beards and the turban and whatnot, and are a minority group in India, and people are lashing out at them because that was their cartoon view of what a person from the Middle East would look like.
Right.
I think there were several cases like that.
Yeah, it's hard enough to be a minority, let alone to be mistaken for another minority. That must have been a very bizarre and difficult time to live in the U.S.
I can only imagine. I mean, I'll speak for all of us in that I think thus far it's been pretty easy being a white male in this country, and I've skirted by.
Fair assessment.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I mean, just not having to worry about that alone is something, we have the benefit of without really appreciating it.
Yeah, we're very privileged in that regard.
Yeah, I've never had someone hate me because I was who I was. Someone only hated me because of how I acted, not how I looked.
Makes sense, yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe back to the China thing a bit. So,
sorry.
No, that was a good conversation. Really, it was a nice, interesting way to see how we all formed our opinions about U.S. foreign policy. I was just wondering, in general, with the Uyghurs, I haven't really seen much in the press about them, the internment camps and stuff like that, or the alleged internment camps. Has been anything going on with that recently?
I keep seeing people arguing about it on Twitter, basically, but I think the problem is that it's a remote part of China, and China does a pretty competent job of suppressing, outside foreign media people from snooping around to a certain degree. So while something's definitely going on there, it's hard for the outside world to really be able to see it. And a lot of the times the news stories you do see about it are from complete psychopath, cult, Christian, Chinese exiles who are just, feeding nonsense to the Western media, who takes it and runs with it for the lack of anything else to really go off of.
Right, not credible sources.
Yeah, you get a lot of that with North Korea for the same reason.
I saw an interesting article a couple months ago. I cannot verify the authenticity, but it featured a picture of a Uyghur model, a guy he lived part-time I think it was a different country. It could have been China, I don't know. But he was in the region, or even Mongolia maybe. He might have been Mongolian. And so he spent most of his time in a different country doing his modeling job, and he would come back to China every now and then. And the picture showed him being chained to a bed, and he's taking a selfie of like him looking kind of sad and then being chained on a bed. And he claims that he was locked up there for, I don't know how long, but just days, let's say, or hours. And he managed to smuggle a phone in and take some pictures. Did either of you see the article as well?
I don't think so.
No, okay.
No, I haven't seen that.
No, it's like one of the only accounts we have of the treatment in those re-education camps is what that person testified and took a picture. So I really wonder where that guy is now and if he's still alive.
Yeah. That's the thing is China, doesn't treat many people that great, especially in the rural areas where they're basically just hauling people into factories to work and moving people around and stuff. It's hard to really see what they could be doing to a specific ethnic group, I guess. So.
Right. It's alleged that they're using forced labor to produce products that they export to different countries, which would make Western countries also solely reliable, but also kind of being part of the whole process, which is very sad.
Yeah, I mean, if you exclude the ethnic minority element to it, we've been using Apple products for years that were being built in factories with nets around the base of the factory to prevent the workers from jumping off the roof and killing themselves because they were basically conscripted labor.
Yeah, I've heard about that as well. Very sad.
We've shifted slavery from the U.S. to other countries, right? The value of things is falsely suppressed because we have been enslaving people long enough to think that things aren't really as expensive as they are, right?
Yeah, like that.
It's the same thing with food, right? Like we pay workers fucking table scraps so we can have strawberries for $2 on our table. Like someone has to hand pick all those damn things. It's not machinery.
Yeah, for decades, I think the economic trend has been towards just flooding the market with cheap garbage that Americans will buy over and over and over again. The way you flood the market with all that garbage is overseas manufacturings where the wages are at the rock bottom. Also material costs. If you want to open a factory in the United States to build iPhone, the challenges of setting up a supply chain to support that alone, make it completely impractical.
Well, part of that too, right, is like having a subgroup of Americans that can't afford products at actual prices. You need a lower class in order to buy all that garbage anyway.
It's a very systemic problem, yeah. That it's hard to find the point to even start to where you would improve the situation.
No idea.
If I were to summarize my outlook in terms of the United States and all the countries in the world, I would just say they all suck. They suck to varying degrees. Some of them suck, but they don't really have the ability to make as much of an impact as the United States. And, that's why when we're looking at like China and some of these other countries, yeah, China sucks and everything, but, I'm in the United States and I live in a country with plenty of its own problems. So,
yeah, totally. For anyone listening from a different country, I think we're all pretty impartial as far as how we feel about the U.S. We realize that there are lots of atrocities that the U.S. did, and it certainly got something broken if it's the richest country in the world and has such a big poverty rate. But I think we are just generally commenting on different countries without trying to be biased.
Oh yeah, we're not blind to our own failings.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, but did you know that poor people in the United States can afford a refrigerator?
What? I don't get it, sorry.
That was like an old Fox News meme of like a screenshot of one of the segments they were doing. Poor people in the United States can afford a microwave or a refrigerator.
Yeah, TV, and yeah, it was like a list of things that are luxury items around the world, and it was things that you would need to survive in the U.S. An air conditioner, I think, was one, if I remember correctly. It was like just ludicrous.
Yeah, I guess depending on where you live, right? If you're in Arizona, it might be more important than, I don't know, California. So any parting thoughts or final words before we call it a day?
Well, I just want to say, love what you guys are doing here. As a consumer of podcasts, it's always been something you think like, I wonder what it would be like to be on a podcast. So
You just talked to a couple of idiots.
Yeah.
yeah, that's probably what it's like for every podcast, actually, now that you boil it down to that.
Idiots talking.
We've unlocked the secrets of the medium.
Yeah, we're happy to go with that status quo and do the same thing.
Yeah, hey, thanks for your time, Tom. It is appreciated.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Well, anything from you, Scott?
No, I would just say if you're listening to this, try to make the world a better place by making individual decisions that benefit people around you.
Great advice. That's it.
Yep. As always, I am sorry you had to listen to this, and have a good rest of your time.